Welcome to the Workers' Reading Room. Today I'll be reading Chapter 7 of F.I.S.T. by Joe Eszterhas, but first a quick recap. In the previous chapter, Johnny attempts to talk his fellow workers into fighting back against Gant by refusing to work. None of the workers think it's a good idea and even begin showing anger at Johnny behind his back, with Al Dorset being one of his only defenders. Abe tries to talk Johnny out of his plan, but Johnny is having none of it. One day, while severely drunk, Gant constantly harasses Lincoln Dombrowski, causing Lincoln to drop some merchandise. While the men tried to help Lincoln, Al Dorset gets fired for not hearing Gant. In a rage, Dorset attacks Gant, but is severely beaten by the guard. When they find out that Dorset is being arrested for assault, Lincoln expresses his support for Johnny's plan. Later on a cold and snowy night, we are introduced to Mike Monahan, driver for Consolidated Trucking and head of the local 302 union, and a man with a bullseye on his back from his company. Monahan delivers tomatoes to Fleckner Brothers' warehouse, where Johnny and the men make their move. Threatening to let the tomatoes freeze if they don't speak to Fleckner, they eventually meet and come to an agreement with one of Fleckner's managers. We ended the chapter with the men jubilant over their victory, while Mike Monahan stood by watching the whole thing, shocked and amazed. And now, F.I.S.T., Chapter 7. The plate glass windows of Ziggy's tavern were dusty and frosted, but from their table the world outside was a shimmering and unspoiled place, peaceful, immaculate, inviting. They sat in the corner around a little table with a torn red check tablecloth, Johnny, Abe, Dombrowski, Abruzzi, and Faflick, celebrating, recounting the details of their triumphant night, telling each other that, honest to God, it had really happened. They had really won. They babbled. Abruzzi: "Did you see the look on Gant's face when Johnny got up on that goddamn platform?" Dombrowski: "I can't believe Gant's finally gonna get his." Faflick: "That fucking guard down on the floor, I thought Link was gonna squash him." A waitress brought them mugs of foamy Pilsner. She was young, red-headed, and curvy, and when she walked, everything jiggled. And when she bent over them with their mugs, she stuck right into their faces. "I'd like to squash those," Johnny said to Faflick. "Come on," Abe said. "She's gonna hear you." At the long bar, Anton Jugovich, a beefy, broad-shouldered steel worker who had once been a prize fighter, challenged anyone to arm wrestle. None of the half-dozen tired men standing there were eager to accept, not even for the penny stakes. The bar was old and worn. On top of it were this week's Hungarian, Serbian, and German newspapers. Above it were 5 framed photographs of Vilma Bonke, the pouty Budapest movie queen who was the girl of Ziggy Zagon's most feverish dreams. Greasy wooden doors led from the bar to the kitchen, where the cook, even at this hour, prepared goulash and chicken paprikash for the men who came in from the late shifts at the mills. They sat in the corner, boisterous and happy, the Pilsner and their adrenaline fueling them, and raised their mugs, clinking them together, spilling some of the beer on themselves. "Here's to Johnny," Abruzzi yelled. "Abe," Johnny said. "Here's to Abe." "Here's to Lincoln," Abe laughed. "Abe Lincoln," Johnny roared. Faflick, slurring his words, said, "Franklin Delano Roosevelt." Link said, "Don't forget Roosevelt Dombrowski." They laughed and downed their mugs. The waitress edged over to them, leery of their raucousness. "You want another?" she said. "Another?" Johnny laughed. "We want the whole damn barrel." She turned and he reached out and grabbed her around her thin waist, laughing, and pulled her against him, pressing her breasts against his shoulders. "Don't touch the merchandise, Buster," she snapped. She pushed herself away from him. "You break it, you pay for it," Faflick slurred, imitating Gant, and they roared again. The girl stood there angrily, resenting their laughter. "Why can't you be a gentleman?" she asked Johnny. She looked at Abe. "Like your friend here." "A gentleman," Johnny boomed. "A gentleman. Did you hear that, Abe?" Red-faced, slightly tipsy, he pounded Abe's back. The girl looked at him reproachfully and huffed angrily away. "Pig Johnny," someone shouted from the bar in a deep voice. It was Ziggy Zagon, the owner. "What you do to the girl?" He went to their table. He wore black boots, black pants, a rumpled white shirt, and a black leather vest which strained over his beer belly. He had a curled and waxed mustache. He was 57 years old. an irascible, crotchety man who was a father protector to his customers. Ziggy helped them with their naturalization papers and legal problems. He collected the money for their fraternal life insurance policies. He made sure they paid their Holy Name Society dues. He made out the money orders when they wanted to send $3 or $4 back to the old country. Ziggy let them run bar tabs, short ones. He let them roll dice for drinks, quietly. He sold them bottles after the liquor stores were closed, for a nickel extra. He was the kind of man who kept his first $20 bill framed above the bar. And he was the kind of man who told no one that out of that first $20, he had to hand back $19.90 change. His tavern had but one rule: all the fighting had to be done inside. Any man who fought in the street outside could never come back in again. Ziggy was a good American citizen, a man who paid his taxes and helped the ward boss put all the votes into the Democratic column. Permanent banishment was the price of tarnishing his spotless civic reputation. "You're a pig," Ziggy Zagon said to Johnny. "You attack her." "I didn't do nothing," Johnny laughed. "She fell right into my arms. She attacked me." Yeah, sure," Ziggy said. "Abe, you witness. You good boy. He grabbed her bazoom." "Bazoom?" Johnny roared. "Her bazoom? Jesus Christ, Ziggy." They laughed. Ziggy laughed with them and sat down. Johnny introduced him to Faflik, Abruzzi, and Dombrowski. Yeah, Ziggy said. "Dombrowski. Very funny." "It's his name," Abe said. Yeah, his name. And I black." They told him about their victory at the warehouse tonight, and Ziggy, as expected, said, You full of the crap, Johnny," shook his head, and brought them a round of bourbon to go with their pilsners. "Hey, Zig," Johnny laughed. "Where's that gypsy of yours, anyway? How come he ain't in here with his fiddle? I want to show this Polak some good music." "In Detroit," Ziggy said. "Rich man." "The gypsy's a rich man?" Johnny laughed. "How'd he get so rich?" "His woman," Ziggy said. "Gypsy woman. She tell the fortune from the bump in the head. She got the little place up off of Columbus Avenue. She tell the future in there. The people go see her, most of 'em women. Women got money, come down in the car, see the gypsy woman. They want to know if the husband attacks somebody. Grab the bazoom." They laughed. Gypsy woman look at bump on the head, freckle on the nose, say, yeah, husband attack, grab the bazoom, yeah, see off of the bump. "The bump," Johnny laughed. "That's great." "One woman go up to the gypsy woman, go all the time, good customer. So she go one time, say she no feel good, pain in the belly. Gypsy woman look at the bump, she say, uh-oh, big trouble you got, big trouble, you got the cancer. Woman cry, big cancer. Gypsy woman said, "You come back, we fix up the cancer. Big trouble, but you come back, all fix." "That bump's gotta be a hell of a bump," Johnny laughed. Woman go back, gypsy woman look at the bump, she say, "Money the trouble. Money you got is devil money. Devil on the dollars you got. We gotta fix the dollars up. We fix up dollars, you got no more cancer." Woman very happy, no more the cancer. No more the pain in the belly. Woman say, "How can we fix up the dollars?" Gypsy woman say, "We clean 'em." Woman say, "How we clean 'em?" Gypsy woman say, yeah, you bring all the dollar you got. You bring 'em in the big bill." They laughed. Abe said, "Didn't fool around with nickels and dimes, huh?" "The truth," Ziggy said. "Woman go back next week. She got $10,000, $100 bills. Every penny she got, she took 'em to Gypsy woman so she can fix the cancer. Gypsy took money, put in a little bag. Sew up the bag good with the needle, magic words. Money clean, no more devil. Gypsy take bag with the money, sew bag in woman's dress, put bag over heart. Gypsy woman say, "You keep dress on, 2 week. You go to bed with dress, no take off, no bath, no nothing. 2 weeks, no cancer." Johnny laughed. "Shit, Ziggy." "Truth, all truth. Woman sleep with dress, no bath, no nothing. Stink like hell. 2 weeks go by, still the pain in her belly. She take dress off. Smart woman, she take bag, open up. Paper inside. No money. She cry, big cry. Still got the cancer and got no money. Big cry. She go to police. Police come to me. No gypsy. Gypsy go away with woman. He say, Detroit. Rich gypsy, $10,000. They laughed. Gypsies say all the time, Ziggy said. Street in America full of gold. They laughed again. Gypsy no kidding, Ziggy said. He find. Ziggy laughed, ordered them another round of bourbon, told Johnny to keep his hands off the waitress's bazoom, and went back to the bar. That gypsy's gotta be like all hunkies, Dombrowski said. I heard all of you was thieves. Johnny laughed. He's a hell of a guy, Ziggy. Anything gets out of hand, he gets the seltzer bottle, nails you in the back of the head with it. Anybody that's a customer here dies, he buys him a big wreath, shows up at the funeral. He comes back here and everybody gets free drinks for an hour. He tells them, it ain't on me, it's on that poor son of a bitch that can't buy drinks no more. Johnny looked away from them. My old man loved him. You know what? Faflick said. I think I'm getting stiff. That stuff about the bump? What the hell was that about? They laughed. At the bar, Anton Jugovich had run out of challengers. Johnny, he yelled. You come, we wrestle. I don't want to wrestle, Johnny laughed. Go on, Johnny, bust his damn arm, one of the men at the bar yelled. Johnny was still laughing. Go on, Link, you can take him. Dombrowski looked at him pop-eyed. I ain't wrestling nobody in a bar full of hunkies. Ziggy flipped a penny to their table. Get up here already. Johnny stood up, and as the men hooted and laughed, he took his jacket off with a flourish and walked up to the bar. Jugovich, who had his elbow up on the bar already, flexed his hammock hands. Now wait a minute, Jugs, Johnny grinned. We gotta get a couple things straight, he winked at Ziggy. The men laughed. Lot of gab, Anton Jugovich said. Let's go. First, Johnny paused and looked at the men in the tavern theatrically. You beat me, you ain't gonna jump up on the bar again and start doing your dance, okay? The men laughed. Come on, Jugovich said, his hand in the air. Second, I beat you, you're not gonna spill no booze on the bar and light the place up again, okay? You do that, Ziggy said, I'm gonna break his head. Okay, Jugovich said. Johnny put his arm down on the bar, and with all the men standing around them, they locked their hands. Ziggy lighted a match, dropped it, and when it fell to the bar, they strained at each other's arms. 3 minutes later, they were still at it, back and forth until Jugovich's arm sunk slowly to the bar. The men cheered. Johnny flexed his muscles. Now remember what I told you, Jugs, he said. Ziggy poured him another shot of bourbon, and Johnny downed it in one gulp. Who's next? He laughed. Come on up here and lose. Abe took his jacket off, and as the men cheered, walked up to the bar. You really want to do this, huh? Johnny grinned. I can take you, Johnny, Abe smiled. Never. Ziggy dropped the match again, and, as Johnny strained, he could see the waitress. She had moved closer and was watching them. Johnny pushed his arm back, and then, suddenly, he slammed Abe's arm roughly to the bar. He winked at the girl. She looked disdainfully away from him. 2 out of 3, Abe said. He was holding his sore arm. It got a big laugh and another free drink for the both of them. When they walked out into the snow, all of them were off balance, shuffling against each other. Jesus Christ, it's cold, Faflick said. Johnny laughed. He felt on top of the world. He had won. It was one of the best days of his whole life. It ain't cold, he said. It's 100 degrees. They staggered happily down the frigid, wind-blown street. When he got home, his lurching and fumbling woke his mother up. She looked at him and saw that he had been drinking. Hey, Ma, he said, holding her. We won, Ma, we won. What you win, Johnny? She said. You drunk. She went back to bed, peeved, and left him in the kitchen. He smiled to himself and dug it out of his pocket. I brought it home for you, Pa, he thought. He stumbled up the stairs and fell into bed, secure in the knowledge that it was down there in pieces on the old man's kitchen table, that he would never have to hear Gant's buzzer again, that finally, for the first time in his life, he had really won. When he opened his eyes, his head felt like it weighed more than 6 crates of grapefruits. He turned it gingerly toward the window. Foot-long icicles hung from the roof, but the snow had stopped. The house was quiet. He remembered that it was Friday, first Friday. His mother had already left for the 6:30 Mass at St. Stephen's. She never missed one. She wanted to have all the bonuses when she died. His mother was probably already worth a couple centuries of sanctifying grace. She was rich. He smiled, lifted his head again, grimaced from the pain, and rested it back on the pillow. He had a couple more minutes. He couldn't fall asleep again, though. Wouldn't that be funny? He could just see it. After last night, oversleeping today of all days, they would can him for sure. He tried to remember his dream. It was about that girl again. The one he got into the brawl over down on the square that time Sabo was giving his speech. The girl they called Anna. The tall, willowy blonde with sensational legs, with the white skin. It was a funny dream. He had the girl in a car. It was his car, a car as flashy as Vince's Stutz. He was putting the make on her. The girl wouldn't go. Go? Hell, she wouldn't even kiss him. He had his hand on that gossamer hair. He was looking right into those green eyes. Please, he said, but the girl wouldn't kiss him. I don't know you well enough, she said. Johnny brought his head up suddenly from the pillow and, bolting straight up in bed, shook it. His head felt like it was going to explode. He shook it again. Christ, Ziggy's goddamn whiskey. It was probably made out of tree leaves in the kitchen. What an asshole dream, Johnny thought. Saying please. He had never said please. He had never had to say please. But then he had never had a girl like that one either. He smiled and got out of bed. One of these days, he'd see her again. He'd ask her out. He wouldn't have to say please. She'd get to know him well enough, all right. She'd go. Sooner or later, they all went. He chose one of the old man's flannel shirts, pulled the blue sweater his mother had knitted for his birthday over it, and went downstairs. He made himself a cup of coffee, walked over to the kitchen table, and sat down. Gant's buzzer was still there. He wondered what his mother had thought this morning when she had seen it there. She probably thought he had stolen it. Ma always thought the best of him. He took the slab of Salona off the wall, cut himself a few slices of it, found a stale loaf of rye, and washed it down with what was left of his coffee. He felt like another cup, but there wasn't enough time, so he drank 3 glasses of water. He stuck the old man's cap on his head, put his battered jacket on, and walked out. The cold numbed him, and he started to shiver as he walked down the street, his hands in his pockets. His head boomed with each step. His bloodshot eyes burned. He started to tremble, cursed Ziggy's whiskey again, then realized it was something other than the whiskey and the cold. It was fear. There's nothing to be afraid of, he said to himself. Andrews promised us. We made a deal. He had to be straight with us. He didn't give us everything we wanted. He even thanked me for talking to him. Then why was he scared? He walked through the flats, avoiding the snowdrifts. The snow trucks were out already, trying to shovel it away. On the bridges overhead, cars honked. Traffic was snarled. Johnny looked around. It didn't look too bad when it snowed. It was in the summer that everything felt right on top of him, weighing him down. It was in the summer that he felt he couldn't breathe. When the terminal tower looked like a hard-edged stone ruler, ready to bloody him when he broke some of their rules. Maybe that was why he hated the summer so much. A block from the warehouse, he saw cars around the gate, a mob of men. What were all those guys doing there? What were those things off to the side? They looked like armored cars. He raced down the icy, snow-covered street. His head throbbed. His body trembled. He felt nauseous. It can't be, he said to himself. It can't. It can't. Closer now, he saw the scene clearly. The dazzling whiteness opened up in front of him like a black, ugly hole. Behind the gate stood a dozen uniformed guards. All of them were holding shotguns. Gant stood next to them, a bullhorn in his hands. 2 armored cars blocked the truck dock. Near the front door of the warehouse, he saw Andrews, and, with him, in his fur coat, stood Fleckner. Fleckner, who had come from the old country just like him. Fleckner, who could even speak some of the Magyar. Fleckner, who had called him a good worker. Fleckner, who was supposed to be thousands of miles away vacationing. Fleckner, who had put all those words into Andrew's lying, cock-sucking mouth. Fleckner, who had his office high up in the terminal tower. Suddenly, Abe was standing in front of him. He was yelling something into his face, but his words were all jumbled up somehow. They wouldn't sink into Johnny's brain. Everything was moving too fast. Lock us out, Abe was saying. Everybody's canned. Christ, Johnny. Didn't I tell you? Didn't I? Didn't I? He stumbled away from Abe, dazed, the acrid taste of the bacon and coffee in his throat. He fought it down, lost now in the middle of the mob of shouting men. 150 men, shoving toward the gate. Wild-eyed, hungry, excited men. Men who would take their jobs. Up ahead, cut off from him by the new men, Dombrowski held the gate with both hands. He was pulling at it with all his might. He was trying to bring it down. He was screaming. Empty, futile, blasphemous words exploded from his mouth. A guard moved toward him. "Get off the gate," the guard said. Link kept screaming. The guard used his gun butt. Link's hands were bloody. He wouldn't let go of the gate. The guard used his gun butt again. Link kept screaming, holding on. Abruzzi grabbed him around the neck and wrestled him away. Link's hands were a clump of blood. Bones stuck out of the clumps. Link turned, still screaming, Abruzzi hanging onto his neck. He shook Abruzzi off roughly and threw himself into the snow. He dug his bloody hands deep into it. The snow turned pink, then slowly, a bright red. Johnny kept watching Link. He felt someone's eyes off to the side. He turned to Faflick. Faflick didn't say anything. He kept his eyes on him. Johnny could hear his eyes. Faflick's eyes were deafening him. He was dizzy. He could hear Link's screams. He could hear Gant's buzzer. He could hear the thunk of the billy club on Dorset's head. He could hear the tired whine of the hearse as it drove his father's casket to the cemetery. "Johnny?" Abe said. "Johnny, you okay?" He stepped away, bent over, and his vomit gushed onto the snow. Black and brown and green vomit. He forced himself to watch. He felt his whole body shake. The vomit wouldn't stop. He cleared his head and shook off Abe's arm. He could see Fleckner now. Fleckner, who had been watching him vomit, who was smiling. Andrew stood next to him, puffing his pipe. Gant held his bullhorn. "We need 26 men today. The company is changing personnel." Johnny staggered toward the mob of men crowding the gate. He stopped. Ned Sweeney stood a few feet ahead of him. What was he doing here? He used to be one of them. He had been fired because he'd been a few minutes late. Was he here because he wanted to take one of their jobs? "Sweeney," Johnny mumbled. Sweeney looked away from him. "Sweeney, listen." "I'm sorry, Johnny," Sweeney said. "I got my kids. I gotta get a job. Maybe he'll take me back." "But Sweeney," Johnny said, "when you got canned, all the guys, Sweeney, Jesus Christ. What are you doing down here?" Sweeney stepped right away from him and raised his hand into the air. "Right here, Mr. Gant," Sweeney said. "I'm a good worker. I'm not going to be late again." Johnny watched Sweeney begging, then hurled himself against the gate, at Gant. He felt the cold steel snap against his body. Gant was inches away from him, protected by the gate. A guard moved toward him and swung his gun butt at the gate. Johnny ducked. The butt just missed his face. "Let me in there," he screamed. "I want to see Fleckner." Gant smiled. The guards were his audience. "Mr. Kovac wants to see Mr. Fleckner." "I'm sorry, Mr. Kovac. Mr. Fleckner is in Florida on vacation." Gant and the guards laughed. In the background, Johnny could see the smile on Fleckner's face. "Come on," he yelled. "We're going in." He pushed at the gate as the guards swung their shotgun butts at it. He could feel bodies behind him trying to push him out of the way. Then someone tried to pull him back from the gate. He turned and saw that it was one of the new men waiting for a job. He shoved the man away. He felt a punch to his kidney and doubled over. He could see Abe swinging at someone now. Abruzzi, some of the other men who were with him last night. Men who had lost their jobs battling men who would get their jobs. Gant and Andrews and Fleckner were smiling. Johnny felt something loosen inside of him. It didn't matter anymore. He didn't care. He felt his fist hitting flesh. Hitting again. He felt a punch above his eye. A punch snapped his nose. Blood dripped down his face. Then he was down on the ground in the snow, men on top of him. A kick to the back of the head. He heard sirens. The men around him scattered. He looked up from the ground. He couldn't see clearly. A blurred figure stood above him. He blinked his eyes. A policeman was holding a billy club. His mouth was a snarl. The club rose into the air. It was coming down. Lower now. Lower. He threw his hands in front of his face. His head exploded. The snow turned coal black. Inside the blackness, there were 3 of them in the police wagon. The old man held him in his lap. His mother was crying. The wagon thudded through the streets of Truetown. They had come in the middle of the night for them. They had wakened them from their beds, pushed them into the wagon. They were taking them to jail for the night, because they were greenhorns, because their papers had to be checked, because maybe they'd be deported. It was by order of the Attorney General, a man named Palmer. The wagon thudded. The old man held him in his lap. His mother was crying. Johnny opened his eyes. The blackness became dim light. The police wagon thudded through the chuck-holed streets of the flats. Abe said, "Johnny, you okay?" He nodded. There were a dozen men around him on the floor. Men who could thank him for losing their jobs. Faflik held his head in his hands. Abruzzi's eyes were closed. There was a deep gash across his forehead. Dombrowski sat across from him, his blood-crusted hands lifeless in his lap. The other men stared at him. Johnny glanced at them, then looked shamefully away. Abe said to them, "It's not Johnny's fault." No one said anything. Johnny felt their eyes. He had to say something to them, but what could he possibly say? "Listen," he said. He stopped, cleared his throat. His mouth was dry. His lips wouldn't form the words. "I didn't know they'd—" He stopped again. He looked at Dombrowski. "Link, you were there. You heard." "Ain't nothing new," Dombrowski said, his eyes on the floor of the police wagon. Abe said, "He told us, Link. He even said you'd get paid back for the peaches." "Nothing new," Dombrowski whispered. "Johnny, don't you know? We're all of us Polacks." The black man held his broken hands out to him and smiled. He stood in the line in front of the desk sergeant's desk at Central Police Station. The desk sergeant had a veinous nose which squatted over his face. He spoke in a droning monotone and never looked up at the men in front of him. "Last name, first name, middle initial?" "Kovac, John J." "Address?" 122 Benston, The Flats. "Previous arrests?" Johnny shook his head. The desk sergeant didn't look at him. "Previous arrests?" he said again. "Nothing." "Age?" 22. "Place of birth?" "Ellis Island, New York." "I didn't ask where you come in," the desk sergeant said. "I asked you where you were born." "I was born there." The desk sergeant looked up at him for the first time and smiled. He had dirty yellow teeth. "Wise guy, huh?" he said. "Nobody's born there." Johnny didn't say anything. The desk sergeant wrote it down. "Louis," he said to another policeman, "let's put this joker in the tank with the bows. Let's see how wise he is in there." The policeman led Johnny to a small cell filled with ragged, unwashed men. Their sour stink overpowered him as he stepped into the cell, and for a moment, Johnny thought he was going to vomit again. He gagged. The men watched him and laughed. "Sit down, boy," the tattooed man said to him. "Make yourself at home." "What the hell'd you do?" said another, looking at Johnny's bruised face. "Take on the whole mother-humping police department?" The tattooed man says, "He looks worse than you smell, Harry. That's why they put him in here." "They put him in here," Harry laughed, "'cause they figured he ain't got enough of a nose left to smell us with." They sat there slapping their knees and laughing. Johnny looked them over and tried to smile. The one called Harry was in his 60s. He had bright, perceptive eyes which peered out from under tufted eyebrows. Most of them had flat chests, skinny arms, and sagging bellies. Their shoes were flattened or had adhesive tape wrapped around their arches. The skin was stretched so tightly across their faces they almost looked like dead men. A few lay on folded newspapers, which were their pillows. "Give him a cigarette," the one called Harry said. Johnny took the cigarette, lighted it, sucked on it, and gagged again. He realized he couldn't draw much air through his nose. "It's gonna kill him," the tattooed man said. "There's worse ways to die," Harry smiled. After a few hours, he got used to the smell. They asked him about his face, and he told them that he had gotten into a fight he should have known he couldn't win. They thought that was funny. In a way, it wasn't even a lie. He was happy to be away from Abe and Dombrowski and the others. Happy to be away from their eyes, their bloody faces, their scars. Happy to be away from Link's busted hands. To the men here, he was just another down-on-his-luck stiff. They didn't know what he had done. He liked them. They were a kind of family of hobos from down by the riverbank. Harry, the eldest among them, was their leader. They had lived contentedly in their tar paper shacks until the snowstorm blew in off Lake Erie. Their shacks were blown to the ground. They couldn't even keep their bonfires going. They went down to the Salvation Army and asked for shelter. They told the truth. They were freezing to death. The Sallies wouldn't take them in. So they trooped down to the relief and the same thing happened. They realized they only had one chance to stay alive. Jail. They went down to Central Police Station, confessed petty thefts, and surrendered themselves. 9 hobos who wanted to come in from the cold. The cops wouldn't accept their crimes and threw them back outside. Then Harry came up with his idea. They went back down to the police station, this time with bricks in their hands. They hurled the bricks through the police station's glass front windows. They were arrested for malicious destruction of property. They got a 2-week sentence. "Here we are," Harry told Johnny, "out of the cold, with our own lovely cell, alive." "For another 2 weeks," the tattooed man said. Late at night, when the others were asleep, Johnny huddled against the wall and thought about this day, the longest day of his life. Last night at about this time he had been at Ziggy's, grab-assing that waitress, getting drunk. He thought he had won. Now here he was in jail for the first time in his life, with a cell full of hobos, jobless again. And worse, all those guys were jobless because of him. Guys with families, children, doctor's bills. What would happen to the brother Fawflick was taking care of? Would a Bruzy have to go back to his sand pile? And Link? What kind of job would Link get with those hands? He knew that they didn't want to do it. He had talked them into it. But did he really think they'd have it better if they went up against Gant? Or was Abe right about what he had said at Christmas? Did he put them all up to it just because he couldn't stand Gant? Because he knew he couldn't beat Gant alone? Had he just been using all those guys? Playing games with their lives, their kids' lives, just to beat Gant? And what would he do now? Go back out on the street and start looking for another job? Forget what had happened? Forget how they had kicked the shit out of him? Or could he get even with the bastard somehow? But how? How could anybody ever get even with them? How could it ever end any other way except the way it had ended today? But what about Dorset then? Why did Dorset go after Gant on that platform? After the way Dorset had let Gant humiliate him at the gate? After what he had told him? "You can't beat him, kid. You're young. You'll see." Then why did Dorset do it? If you couldn't beat them, then why did Dorset do it? And look where it got him. Into the prison ward, facing 6 months for assault. In the morning, a policeman woke him up. "Okay, Kovac, you got friends. Get your ass out of here." Harry and the other hobos looked at him. "Glad it ain't us that's getting out," Harry said. He didn't know what to say to them. Finally, he said, "Thanks for the cigarette and stuff." "Stay warm, kid," Harry said. "Go get a new face," the tattooed one laughed. He walked out of the cell block into the hall. Jocko stood there flashing his teeth. "Who'd you run into?" Jocko said. "Joe Louis?" It hit him then. "You got friends," the policeman had said. They shouldn't be releasing him for another day. Abe and the other guys were still in their cells, and he was getting out because of Vince. The guy who had caused it all, and he was going free. Was that fair? "Ain't nothing that's fair." That's what Dorset had said. "The boss heard about it," Jocko said. "He's outside waiting for you, Johnny." He hesitated and thought about telling the desk sergeant he wanted to go back inside. Then he thought about the smell hitting him again and changed his mind. He walked out after Jocko, breathing deeply of the fresh air. Vince's Stutes was at the curb. He got into the back seat next to him. Jocko started the car and drove it away from the jail. Vince Doyle looked at Johnny and grinned. "How's the jailbird?" he said. "Who asked you, Vince?" "You gotta go out and save the whole fucking world, don't you, Johnny?" Vince Doyle said. He didn't know what to say. Finally, he said, "That son of a bitch at Fleckner's. He shook my hand." Vince Doyle laughed. "Yeah, I know you were down at Ziggy's celebrating." "Lay off of me, Vince. I didn't ask you to get me out." "Christ, Johnny, you don't go screwing with people like that. You got no push." "He shook my hand," Johnny said. "He said we had a deal." Vince Doyle laughed. "He shook your hand. What the hell is that? Some kind of blood oath? This ain't the old country, Johnny." "I'm gonna get the fuckers," Johnny said, spitting the words. "They're gonna pay." "Yeah, sure," Vince Doyle grinned. "Sure. You come back with me, Johnny. They'll pay," he laughed. "We'll both get rich." Johnny shook his head. "Money," he said angrily. "That's all you care about, isn't it?" "That's all there is," Vince Doyle said. "There's nothing else." They dropped him in the flats, a block from his home. But he thought about what his mother would say, about the way she'd look at him when she saw his swollen face. He turned around and walked away from the house. He passed a soup line and realized suddenly how hungry he was. He had never stood in a soup line before. He had never sunk that low. But the soup didn't smell bad and there weren't many men in the line, and he thought, what difference is this soup line going to make? He had caused more than 20 men to lose their jobs. He had just spent the night with a cell full of hobos. He waited in line a few minutes, then stepped up into the back of the truck. A man ladled some soup into a paper container and handed it to him. Johnny looked at it. He saw that it was nothing but greasy water. He stumbled out of the truck, drank the grease, and walked on. He walked aimlessly. He didn't want to go home. He didn't want to see Vince again. Abe was still in jail. He kept walking. He didn't know where to go. He didn't know what to do. Then he remembered Dorset. That was it. Dorset. He'd go see Dorset again. He'd ask Dorset why he did it, why he had gone after Gant. He had to know why. It would help him to know why. He walked up the long hill out of the flats, through Public Square, and an hour later stood in front of a policeman in Metropolitan General Hospital's prison ward. The policeman sat at a desk talking to someone on the telephone. He looked up at Johnny, the phone still in his hand. "I'm here to see Al Dorset," Johnny said. The policeman looked at him and didn't say anything. "He's a friend of mine." "He isn't here," the policeman said. "Where is he?" "He's down at the morgue." Johnny could feel himself starting to tremble again. "He hung himself," the policeman said, and started talking into the phone again. Johnny stood there a moment, and then he heard himself say, "Why?" It came thin and mushy out of his mouth. The policeman hung the telephone up and looked at him annoyed. "What?" "Why?" "How the hell should I know?" the policeman said. And that is the end of Chapter 7 of F.I.S.T. Thank you all for listening to the Workers' Reading Room. I hope you have a good day.